My first guest tonight is Victorian Liberal MP Tim Wilson. Tim Wilson, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Patricia.
The government avoided an embarrassing defeat in the House of Representatives on the last sitting day, but of course this Nauru evacuation bill will come back to the House of Reps. It'll just come back in February. So haven't you just delayed the inevitable?
Well, if you focus on parliamentary tactics, as you are, then we'll wait and see what happens when it comes around in February. Obviously, it's been addressed in the Senate, and we'll wait and see what happens. But really, this isn't actually about parliamentary tactics, Patricia.
Well, it was all about parliamentary tactics.
Well, it might be for you, but for me, obviously, being somebody who's always been very concerned about refugees and about their best interests, this is ultimately an issue about human lives and processes and what we're going to do as a country, and making sure that we have secure borders and national security. They're critical, they're paramount. If a government can't protect its own people and secure its own borders, then it has no legitimacy, while also making sure that we get people who are on Nauru Manus Island resettled in an orderly way, but we continue to accept refugees who are recommended to us by the UN.
OK, but if you look at the facts, why would this make this country's borders more susceptible to trouble, more susceptible to more refugees and boats coming, when there are already many, many refugees in Australia who've been brought over for medical reasons? We've got refugees that were in offshore detention who are now in the US. These things haven't meant that the boats have started again. Well,
boats do occasionally test our border security arrangements, but the challenge with this piece of legislation that was put forward is that it creates an automatic pathway and direct incentives aligned with it versus discretion and managing it as part of a government program. And at any point, if people seek to abuse the goodwill of the Australian people and the government, then the government has the discretion to be able to stop it rather than being overruled by the Parliament.
So you really think this piece of legislation is going to start boats again? You really think that?
No, I think you need to be very clear about what I'm saying, which is it creates incentives and pathways for people to come, including from, potentially to self-harm as a justification to be able to get into Australia because the test was people's health and health assessments.
So you think that this bill risks that people will self-harm just to get to Australia?
I think it creates incentives, and the basis of it is health, and that's the principle sitting behind it. I didn't write it, and that therefore will lead people to make choices about how they behave and respond as a pathway to get into Australia.
What's your evidence that people would self-harm?
No, hang on. What I've said is at every point we want people to be able to resettle. We're resettling people to the United States, and we need to make sure that people's health is paramount. We have to make sure that their security is paramount, and we have to make sure we have an orderly process to be in a position to be able to resettle people and transfer people as appropriate. OK,
you said it wasn't about parliamentary tactics, but the numbers on the floor demonstrated that this would have passed the lower house. So haven't you just... It's undemocratic, isn't it? If you haven't let the House actually make that determination, you've actually messed with democracy, haven't you?
Well, I didn't say it was about parliamentary tactics. I said you can focus on the parliamentary tactics, or you can focus on the real people and their lives.
But if you're going to let democracy do its job, the numbers are on the floor to pass this. So you've actually stopped the democratic process.
No. Well, the House of Representatives rose. It always rises at 5 o'clock on a Thursday. Let's wait and see what happens early next year.
Well, it will pass, right?
I don't have an answer. I'm not in February yet.
OK, so why would it change?
Well, because circumstances might change. People might see different reasons why they might change their behaviour in terms of voting. OK. Just on some other issues, that the gay legislation, I'm calling it very... It's not really gay legislation.
No, it's legislation about students...
The Sex Discrimination Act, which provides general application
Let me ask
provisions.
the question now.
Yeah,
everyone knows people. What the legislation is broadly. It's the legislation that means that kids can't be expelled from school for being gay, lesbian, transgender.
It's actually broader than that, but yes.
Yeah. So this hasn't passed, even though the government said it would be dealt with by the end of the year, right?
Yes.
Labor says that it has advice that the legislation, that the changes the government wants to make would widen discrimination.
Yeah, and I'm calling that's complete rubbish.
OK, so how would your amendments, the government amendments, change things? What would happen at a school?
Well, the provision that's currently there under Section 38(3) gives a general exemption to religious schools to be able to decide who can come into the school or not, enrol in the school or not.
Yep.
We would be getting rid of that provision and making sure there were no general exemptions to the Sex Discrimination Act. And then it simply inserts a new provision which says that schools are allowed to continue teaching consistent with their faith-based practice. Now, Labor said they actually support that principle. They just don't seem to support inserting it in the legislation. If you actually go and read the text that was circulated, it's quite clear that it relates simply to teaching practice, nothing more. And so I think they're just talking a furphy.
So what sort of things could happen with that protection in it?
Well, what some people want is to have a high degree of confidence that, for instance, if there's a definition of marriage consistent with the faith, that they're going to be able to teach it without having their funding pulled.
How about that other example Amanda Stoker was talking about from Queensland, gay clubs? So if a bunch of gay students, or one or two, I don't know what would happen at different schools, wanted to start a club for gay students, would that be able to be stopped legally under your amendments?
I don't think so. If you go and look at it, as I said, it relates to teaching practices that anyone who wants to inform an informal association would be able to do so, as far as I can aware.
So that would still be permittable? The school
as far as I'm aware.
Stop it?
As far as I'm aware.
OK. So how about the conscience vote? What do you make of that? Because the government in the Wentworth by-election said it wanted to change this law. The Prime Minister made it clear. And now it's a conscience vote. That's different to what he promised.
Well, what we promised was to remove it. We put forward proposals to remove it, but the government's made it clear that it wants to insert provisions to make it clear that faith-based organisations continue to practice and critically, teach the value sets that underpin their faith. And we've said we're prepared to put that matter, those issues, those propositions to a conscience vote. The Labor Party has declined, therefore the issue hasn't been dealt with in the Parliament.
Do you support a conscience vote?
I think a conscience vote is an entirely reasonable proposition. I mean, it's not a secret that was my view about how issues last year should have been dealt with rather than having a public postal vote. We did that anyway. We got to the outcome, and I'd say this is a good step. We're actually seeing conscience-based issues being dealt with a conscience vote. That's the only people who are blocking it are Labor, like they did, by the way, with the postal service.
OK, Labor has said to me, and many people I've spoken to, you wouldn't have a conscience vote on discrimination against a black kid at school, or you wouldn't...
Again, it goes back to what the proposal is. We're removing Section 38.3, which allows for general discrimination. So yes, you wouldn't have a conscience vote on that. But then we're putting in provisions which says we believe that religious-based organisations should be entitled to teach consistent with their faith system. And those are the sorts of issues that sometimes do come up in conscience votes. The question really for Labor is why are they not allowing a conscience vote?
Well, they say that because they're all against discrimination.
Yes, but this is the perversion of the English language. It isn't a matter of discrimination. It's an issue of freedom about whether faith-based organisations should be able to act consistent with their values in their teaching practices. I would have thought that any reasoned person would think that that was something worth supporting. The reason Labor don't want a conscience vote on this, and we know it, is because they know there are a lot of Labor senators and some people in the House who want to vote for it, and Bill Shorten doesn't want to be embarrassed by what is a very simple provision, which frankly a lot more Labor members should support as well.
Just on another issue, the divestment rules, or the big stick approach to energy that the government has introduced, are you entirely comfortable with those laws? Because I know that, well, they haven't passed yet, but there are some Liberals that have been quoted out of the party room who say this is not Liberal policy.
Well, it is Liberal policy because we've adopted it.
It doesn't subscribe to Liberal Party values.
Well, I think we need to be clear. There were earlier versions of the legislation, which, it's not really a secret. I raised my eyebrow at some of the provisions in that, and as per usual, I've worked with the government to get it to a better place. The legislation that's put forward has many grounds why it is entirely consistent with Liberal values, particularly around competition policy, national security, energy security provisions. My view is that there has to be a very high threshold to justify divestment. Those thresholds have been inserted into it. There's recommendations by the ACCC, scaling up of obligations on companies before any action's taken, and then most critically that if there were to follow through, it would have to be on the recommendation to the Treasurer, application to a court with a merit-based process. Now, I don't think that's ever going to happen, and I'm very wary of that being available, but nonetheless, sometimes that can be compelled upon, particularly when companies withdraw supply of energy, which can actually have a significant impact on the security of energy in the country.
Just finally, John Pesutto lost the seat of Hawthorn in the Victorian state-based election.
Very sad.
Yeah, I know that you're a friend of his and you support him, but he did an interview with John Fain on ABC Radio Melbourne. He said many things in this interview, but one of the things that really struck me was a comment he made about his own daughter, a teenager. He said she went to the climate change demonstrations because she wants more climate action, but she wants to be a Liberal, but he feels like your party doesn't have an open door to those kind of values or people like that generationally. Do you share that concern?
Well, I share a concern that people aren't seeing how their lives can be lived through our values, and I think what we need as a party is to have courage and strength and conviction about what we stand for, which is this government actually has an incredible record on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The Emission Reduction Fund, which has been critical in driving reduction in emissions at a cheaper price than was ever delivered under Labor's
sure, but
carbon
your
tax.
policies now, you got rid of the neg, for instance.
Sure, but there are other things that we're doing which have been very successful, and some of us want to celebrate. There is a massive open door in the federal electorate of Goldstein for anyone who shares a forward-looking, modern, liberal vision for this country. And so I say to his daughter, jump on board.
OK, so instead of saying to lots of those protesters, you know, you're going to turn into dole bludgers, or I've heard
I haven't said any of that.
You haven't, no, but some of your colleagues have. Is that the wrong thing to say to those protesters?
Well, I think the important thing to say is that kids should be in school. I mean, I do actually encourage that.
Sure, but
I
the
also
idea of
believe
young people taking action.
Sure, but I have no issue with young people taking action. I just think it's good for them to go to school, and they can do that outside of hours like most other people do as well. You know, people should care about the future. I care about the future of this country and this planet. That's one of the reasons why I'm a Liberal, because I believe in economic leadership, social cohesion, environmental stewardship.
So my question is, would you like to invite those protesters to become Liberal Party members?
Well, I'm not sure.
Rather than to suggest that they're going to become dole bludgers.
I'm not suggesting everybody should suddenly, who was at those protests, shares Liberal values. But if you share Liberal values and you care about the environment, you are concerned about the climate and making sure we take appropriate action, you're concerned about social cohesion, you can go to join.vic.liberal.org.au.
Oh, it's not really a recruitment show, but you know what, Tim Wilson, good try. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, PK.
Tim Wilson there. Well.